Chapter 6. The Curate in the Churchyard. Bascombe was chagrined to find that the persuasive eloquence with which he hoped soon to play upon the convictions of jurymen at his own sweet will had not begotten even communicativeness, not to say confidence, in the mind of a parson who knew himself fooled, and partly that it gave him cause to doubt how far it might be safe to urge his attack in another and to him more important quarter. He had a passion for convincing people, this Hercules of the New World. He sauntered slowly back to his aunt's, husbanding his cigar a little, and looking up at the moon now and then. Not to admire the marvel of her shining, but to think yet again what a fit type of an effete superstition she was, and that she retained her power of fascination even in death. Wingfold walked slowly away, with his eyes on the ground gliding from under his footsteps. It was only 11 o'clock, but this, the oldest part of the town, seemed already asleep. They had not met a single person on their way, and hardly seen a lighted window. But he felt unwilling to go home, which at first he was fain to attribute to his having drunk a little more wine than was good for him, whence this feverishness and restlessness so strange to his experience. In the churchyard, on the other side of which his lodging lay, he turned aside from the flagged path and sat down upon a gravestone, where he was hardly seated ere he began to discover that it was something else than the wine which had made him feel so uncomfortable. What an objectionable young fellow that Bascombe was! Presuming and arrogant to a degree rare, he hoped, even a profession for which insolence was a qualification. What rendered it worse was that his good nature, and indeed every one of his gifts, which were all of the popular order, was subservient to an assumption not only self-satisfied but obtrusive. And yet, the objectionable character of his self-constituted judge being clear as the moon to the mind of the curate, was there not something in what he had said? This much remained undeniable at least, that when the very existence of the church was denounced as a humbug in the hearing of one who ate her bread, and was her pledged servant, his very honesty had kept that man from speaking a word in her behalf. Something must be wrong somewhere. Was it in him or in the church? In him assuredly, whether in her or not. For had he not been unable to utter the simple assertion that he did believe the things which as the mouthpiece of the church he had been speaking in the name of truth every Sunday, would again speak the day after tomorrow? And now the point was, why could he not say he believed them? He never consciously questioned them. He did not question them now. And yet, when a forward, overbearing young infidel of a lawyer put it to him, plump, as if he were in the witness box, or rather indeed in the dock, did he believe a word of what the church had set him to teach? A strange something. Was it honesty? If so, how dishonest had he not hitherto been? Was it diffidence? If so, how presumptuous his position in that church? This nondescript something seemed to raise a viewless obstruction in his throat, and having thus rendered him for the first moment incapable of speaking out like a man, had taught him the next, had it, to quibble. Like a priest, the lawyer fellow would doubtless have said. He must go home and study Paley, or perhaps Butler's Analogy. He owed the church something, and ought to be able to strike a blow for her. It would not Lytton be better, or a more modern writer, say Neander, or Coleridge, or perhaps Dr. Liddon? There were thousands able to fit him out for the silencing of such foolish men as this Bascombe with the shirt front. Wingfold found himself filled with contempt, but the next moment was not sure whether this Bascombe or one Wingfold were the more legitimate object of it. One thing was undeniable. His friends had put him into the priest's office, and he had yielded to go, that he might eat a piece of bread. He had no love for it, except by fits, when the beauty of an anthem or the composition of a collect awoke in him a faint consenting admiration or a weak responsive sympathy. Did he not indeed sometimes despise himself, and that pretty heartily, for earning his bread by work which any pious old woman could do better than he? True, he attended to his duties, not merely did church, but his endeavour also that all things should be done decently and in order. All the same, it remained a fact that if Barrister Bascombe were to stand up and assert in full congregation, as no doubt he was perfectly prepared to do, that there was no God anywhere in the universe, the Reverend Thomas Wingfold could not, on the church's part, prove to anybody that there was. Dared not, indeed, so certain would he be of discomfiture, advance a single argument on his side of the question. Was it even his side of the question? Could he say he believed there was a God? Or was not this all he knew, that there was a Church of England, which paid him for reading public prayers to a God in whom the congregation, and himself, were supposed by some to believe, by others, Bascombe, for instance, not? These reflections were not pleasant, especially with Sunday so near. For what if there were hundreds, yes thousands of books triumphantly settling every question which an overseething and ill-instructed brain might by any chance suggest? What could it boot? How was a poor finite mortal, with much the ordinary faculty and capacity, and but a very small stock already stored, to set about reading, studying, understanding, mastering, appropriating the contents of those thousands of volumes necessary to the arming of him who, without pretending himself the mighty champion to seek the dragon in his den, might yet hope not to let the loathly worms swallow him, armor and all, at one gulp on the highway? Add to this, that, thought of all most dismayful, He had himself to convince first, the worst dragon of all to kill, for bare honesty's sake, in his own field, while all the time he was arming and fighting like the waves of the flowing tide in a sou'wester. Sunday came in upon Sunday, roaring on his flat, defenseless shore. Sunday behind Sunday rose towering in awful perspective, away to the verge of an infinite horizon. Sunday after Sunday of dishonesty and sham, yes, hypocrisy, far worse than any idolatry. To begin now, and in such circumstances, to study the evidences of Christianity were about as reasonable as to send a man whose children were crying for their dinner off to China to make his fortune. He laughed the idea to scorn, discovered that a gravestone on a November midnight was a cold chair for study, rose, stretched himself disconsolately, almost despairingly, looked long at the persistent solidity of the dark church and the waving line of its age-slackened ridge, which, like a mountain range, shot up suddenly in the tower and ceased, then turning away left the houses of the dead crowded all about the house of the resurrection. At the farther gate he turned yet again, and gazed another moment on the tower. Towards the sky it towered, and led his gaze upward. There still soared yet rested the same quiet night with its delicate heaps of transparent blue, its cool glowing moon, its steely stars, and its something he did not understand. He went home a little quieter of heart, as if he had heard from afar something sweet and strange.